Hi, thank you all for being here for Design with the User in Mind, and thank you for staying for the last talk of the day. I'm Alicia Olson. I'm a user experience designer at Tableau Software. And I have a question for all of you. I want you to raise your hand if you've ever used a Tableau dashboard that made you feel confused or lost, you didn't know what was happening. I definitely have too. I have some good news for you. It's not your fault. It's the dashboard designer's fault. Now, maybe you weren't the intended audience for this dashboard, but maybe you were. And maybe the dashboard designer didn't really know what you needed to get out of that dashboard. Today, we're going to talk about how to use design thinking and apply that to your dashboard creation process so that you don't make dashboards that make other people feel confused. And hopefully, we'll get you a step further to dashboards that your users love using. So first, what is user experience design? It's about anticipating our users' needs. And actually, a lot of this is about psychology. It's about learning how other people think, figuring out how they approach problems that they're trying to solve, and giving them what they need before they know they need it. So one of the awesome things about user experience design is that the skill set isn't just a trade. It can be applied to almost anything. Today, I'm going to walk you through the design process. And there's 4 basic stages that we normally talk about here. First, we have the discover phase. So during this phase, we're going to be gathering a lot of information from our users and looking into what they want to get out of this dashboard and why. So it's important during this phase not to limit yourself, to let the conversations go in any direction. We don't want to let our assumptions about what our users need bias us in this phase. Once we finish talking to our users, we're going to move on to this distill phase. And this is where we're going to find patterns in our notes, connect the dots, and develop a better understanding of those users that we talked to during the discover phase. So once we've decided what this dashboard is going to do, we're going to move on to the ideate phase. So here it's important to try not to pass judgment on our ideas just yet. Build on them instead. After we've got a lot of ideas as to how we can enable our users' success, we're going to move on to the validate phase. This is where we're ideally going back to our users and trying to figure out what clicks and what doesn't, and figuring out where we can improve this dashboard. So a really good way to think of these 4 phases is that the first 2 are about making sure we're solving the right problem. If we skip discovery and distill, we might make a great dashboard that really gets at the wrong things that our users didn't really need. The next 2 phases are about solving the problem the right way. So once we know what our users need, let's make sure that the visualizations we have and the way that we've laid everything out is something that makes sense for them so that they can answer the questions that they're looking for. Now, I've mentioned our users a little bit, and I just want to make sure that we know who our user is. How do we know who's using this dashboard? And I'm going to tell you a story. This is my dad. And as you can tell from this picture here, he's a mechanic, and he's a pretty organized one at that. Now, a couple of years ago, my dad decided that he was finally going to get an iPhone. I was very proud of him. And one thing he figured out pretty quickly was that he was definitely going to get a case with this iPhone because he wanted to make sure that it was protected in the shop. And I bet you all know what kind of case he got. He went for the OtterBox. So just knowing those few things about my dad, we can deduce what kind of case was probably best for him. And I definitely made fun of him for this decision because he didn't just get any OtterBox, he got the biggest, bulkiest OtterBox he could possibly find. And honestly, in my opinion, why would you do this to your iPhone? It's such a beautiful piece of hardware. And the OtterBox makes it harder to use. But he didn't care. He loved this OtterBox. And his dedication to it was only strengthened when he lost his phone a couple months later in September. And we live in Florida, and it rains a lot in September, as you may know. And he found it when he was mowing the lawn about a week later. I felt really bad for him. I apologized. I offered to send him one of my old phones because I knew how much he loved that new iPhone he had gotten. But he just laughed at me. The OtterBox protected his phone. The phone works. OtterBox is a customer for life. Now, there are a lot of different iPhones in the market, and this picture just shows a subset of them. But most of these are going to be terrible for my dad. And that's not because they're inherently bad iPhone cases, it's because they're not made for my dad. Just like that OtterBox case wasn't really made for me. So I made a mistake when I was talking to my dad about that iPhone case. I assumed, incorrectly, that since I also use an iPhone, I was a representative user. But I'm not. My dad and I are very different people, even though we're both iPhone users. So this story illustrates how important it is to know who you're designing for and know what their goals are. Now, there's another type of person that you may have run into before that seems like a user, but they're not. They're pretty uppity. They're not totally in touch with the people who are doing most of the work, and they think they're more important than they actually are. Hippo stands for a highly paid person's opinion. Now, most of the time, these opinions are going to be coming from managers, people who want the dashboard to be created, and they have a vested interest in it. But they're not the people who are actually going to be looking at this data in this dashboard day in and day out. And they might have a lot of opinions about what they think needs to go in it, and you might actually have to appease them. You might have to do some work so that that manager is happy. But it's really important to remember when you're talking to these people that they are customers. They're not your user. Your user is the person who is going to be using that dashboard day in and day out. And you need to make sure that you're talking to them as well. So let's get back to those 4 stages of the design process that I talked about. Today, I'm going to go through each of these phases, and I'm going to give you some techniques to use while you're in each of these phases, as well as a couple things just to keep in mind. So first, we have the discover phase. And during this phase, our goal is to find out what our users really need. And our users can be misleading because they're going to try to solve their own problems, and they're going to tell you what solution they're interested in, rather than telling you why they actually want the dashboard. So your job is to figure out what they're getting at when they tell you that solution they want. And one thing to make sure we keep in mind during this phase is to question the obvious. There are no stupid questions during this phase. And what this mantra is going to help us do is to question all of our assumptions. So I'm going to walk you through a technique that's going to help us do just that. This technique is called the 5 whys. And it's exactly what it sounds like. We're going to ask why 5 times. Now, the goal here is not to be an incessant toddler and bother our users and just go, why? It's to get you to push yourself beyond the obvious. Ask those stupid questions and really get to the root of what your users need from you. So this user interview is one that I conducted with a friend of my dad's. His name is John Massey, and he owns a Toyota dealership. Now, John asked me for a dashboard to help him make some business decisions about his shop. So I'm going to walk you through this user interview using the 5 whys as an example. The first thing that John said was that he needs to understand the year and make of vehicle coming into his shop over time. And when I asked him why he needed to see this information, what he told me was, that's obvious. I need to see what cars are coming into my shop. I could have stopped here. I could have assumed I just asked a really stupid question and got on with building that dashboard. It would have looked something like this. He can see the number of vehicles per model coming into the shop per year, as well as the vehicles per day. And he can actually explore this dashboard as well. For example, he can click on Prius, and the rest of the dashboard is going to filter to let him see the distribution of Priuses coming into the shop. And John would probably have been really happy with this dashboard initially, but it has a couple problems. And that's that we didn't really know what he was looking for when he wanted me to build this dashboard. So he's going to look at this, and what he's probably going to end up doing is kind of this mental join in his head of all the data that he knows about, because he's in the shop so often, with what he sees on this dashboard. So he's doing more work than he should probably have to do, and we can do better. So when I asked him why he needed to understand what cars are coming into the shop, what he told me was that he needed to figure out what parts to keep on hand. And this is really interesting, because this is an insight we didn't have before. It's not really about what cars are coming into the shop, it's about the parts. And what he said was, he doesn't want to have these parts on hand because they're expensive, and if he's not going to be going through them, he doesn't want them on hand. There were a couple things that came to my mind when he told me this. So just take a moment and think about why he might have wanted to know this information. The first thing that came to mind for me was cost. The parts are expensive, and maybe he doesn't want to have cash tied up in those parts. The other thing that came to mind was efficiency. If the parts aren't on hand, the vehicles are going to take longer to get fixed. And I could have asked him right here, I could have said, is this about cost or is this about efficiency? What do you want to get out of this information? But that's actually a little bit of a leading question because it doesn't leave room for the answer to be about anything else here. Which brings us to another point. Keep your questions open-ended. So you don't want to lead your users to this or that. You want to keep it in any direction it could go because you don't want to make an assumption about the direction that it might go. Another piece of advice here is not to ask yes or no questions because your users will probably say yes or no. And you want them to elaborate a little bit on what's going on in their head so that you can understand how their thought process works. So let's get back to that user interview. When I asked John why he wanted to know what parts to keep on hand, he told me that he wants to know when a vehicle is waiting on a part shipment. So it was about efficiency. And when I probed a little bit further on this, what he told me was that he wants to understand when a vehicle is not being actively worked on. And parts are one reason that can happen. That's why he thought that the shop wasn't as efficient as he wanted it to be. But there were a couple other reasons other than parts. And when I asked why he needed to understand this information, finally what he told me is that he's looking to eliminate wasted time in his shop. And this is actually really interesting because if you look at the list of questions and the list of answers he gave me, the first one, year and make a vehicle over time, that's going to create a very different dashboard than trying to help John eliminate wasted time in the shop. And the reason that he asked me for this dashboard in the first place was because he wanted to eliminate wasted time. He just didn't tell me that until I talked to him for 10 minutes and pushed a little bit on why he was getting at this dashboard. So here's the final dashboard I ended up making him. As you can see, some of the charts that were in the original dashboard are also here. They weren't complete throwaway charts. But I've added 2 more charts as well. The one on the right shows vehicles on hold, which means they're not being actively worked on, by category. And it shows those 3 different categories, the reasons that they might be on hold. And it also shows what's going on with his technicians. How long does it take them to complete a job compared to the estimated time it should take them to complete? And it looks like the technicians in this shop are actually pretty efficient, but on maintenance they're at 99.3, so maybe we could get a little better there. All right, so I'm going to go through one more technique in the discover phase. And this one is called contextual inquiry. And that's just a fancy design term for follow people around while they do their job and ask them questions while they do their job. And it's important during this technique to make sure that you come from a place of learning. Sometimes if you follow people around while they're doing their job, they think that you're evaluating them and that you might have the power to fire them. So just make sure that they know that that's not what you're doing. If they don't know that, sometimes they'll kind of fudge things and pretend things are different than they are because they're trying to impress you. So I have another example to talk to you about here. And this one involves a design firm called IDEO. And this design firm was asked by a medical device producer to come up with a device that nurses would use to enter data during a very specific medical procedure. And they kind of had something in mind. It was a sleek gadget that looked kind of like an iPad. And they expected the nurses to hold the device in one hand and enter data with their other hand. Now, when the designers talked to the nurses who actually did this procedure, the nurses were totally on board with this concept. I mean, who wouldn't want a device that looks like an iPad to do your job with? But they decided to use contextual inquiry and watch the nurses do their job. And when they did this, they found something really interesting. All of the nurses, the first thing they did was they held the patient's hand. And when the designers asked the nurses in the moment, "What are you doing? Why are you holding the patient's hand?" the nurse said, "Well, that's my job. This is a terrifying procedure. The patient is awake. They're getting a needle inserted into their back. They're scared. Part of my job is to make them feel comfortable." And this is really interesting because the nurses just didn't realize they did this when they were interviewed. It was something that was so mindless and such a basic part of their job that they had no idea that it was going to affect the design of this device that they had been interviewed about. So here's the device that IDEO ended up designing for those nurses. It's a one-handed device so that the nurse can continue to hold the patient's hand. And it doesn't look sleek or sexy, but it does the job well, and that's what's important. So what this shows us here is that we need to pay attention to context. We need to know what context our users are going to be using our dashboards in. Is it going to be on a warehouse floor? Are they going to have internet access? Are they going to be running somewhere on mobile most of the time? Because that's going to affect the basic design of your dashboard. So lastly, I want to touch on one more point, and that is to build what your users need, not what they want. So at the end of the discover phase, you probably talk to your users. They have a lot of ideas that they've told you they want. You have a lot of ideas that you've come up with that you want to give them. And you could just put everything in one dashboard. Unfortunately, that's usually not what we want, because it'll end up looking something like this. This dashboard lets people do a lot. However, unless you're the dashboard designer, it takes a little while to figure out. There's a lot of filters going on here, and you need a pretty good understanding of the data. There's a high learning curve here. And there are definitely cases where this is appropriate, but really 95% of the time it's not what you want. Which is why it's really important to focus in the distill phase. So this phase helps us to develop a perspective about what our dashboard is going to be about. So we're going to take all those notes from our user interviews, which are probably crazy and disorganized, and we're going to distill them down to just 2 or 4 clear goals. But how are we going to do that? This is a really more fuzzy part of the design process, and there are a lot of right ways to do it. So I'm going to introduce you to another technique with another example. This one involves the new Tableau e-learning program, which you may have heard of. But if you haven't, it's a program that lets anyone take a more targeted Tableau class online, rather than needing to schedule a more intensive and time-consuming in-person session. So at Tableau, we wanted to make sure that while we were offering this new program, we were reaching more customers, we were not losing our overall training revenue. And our executives wanted to kind of just keep a pulse on this new program and how it was going, so they could see if there was anything that they wanted to change. So just for context, here's the dashboard that we ended up giving to our executives. So let's walk through how we went from notes to goals for this dashboard. So we interviewed 3 executives at Tableau who were going to be using this dashboard. And we started with the beginning goal of, let's help them understand how the e-learning program is doing. So we asked them a couple questions about how they use their dashboards and how they interact with data today in general, as well as asking about how this might fit into their workflow. So I'm just going to walk you through a couple notes we took for each of these executives. Know that there were a lot more notes here. There were more than could fit on the slides, but just for the sake of explaining this, there's only a couple. So the first person we interviewed here was Andre. And Andre's an executive, and a couple things we noticed here was that Andre's running between meetings a lot. He also updates the executive team about the e-learning program, and he wants to have those numbers top of mind so that he can tell everyone else what they are if he runs into them in the hallway. The next person we talked to was Beth, and she heads up sales for all of our training. Beth keeps the Salesforce dashboard open in her desktop at all times, and one thing we noticed when we asked her about other data that she looks at often, she actually looked up that dashboard name in an email thread in order to find it. So that was interesting to us. Another thing she told us was that she's really excited about celebrating big wins with her team. It's something she does already, and she wants to do it with the e-learning program as well. Finally, we interviewed Charles. And Charles wasn't an executive, but he works with the exec team a lot. He emails data to the CFO weekly. He likes to prep for his meetings using data, so he knows what's going on. But he does get asked for email updates from other people quite frequently. So we noticed a pattern here. And that was that these people aren't necessarily looking at their data in Tableau server that often. They're getting it maybe from mobile or from their email. So they're not checking their dashboards on server as often as they'd like to, even though the intent is there and even though they want to stay up to date on that data. So what we did here was we crystallized this into a goal, and that goal was to help our executives stay up to date on their data. And you'll notice that that goal doesn't say how we're going to do it. That's on purpose. During the distill phase, we want to just make sure that we're talking about what our users want to do. We're going to think about how they're going to do it later. And for some context about what this phase looks like in real life, this is an actual set of sticky notes that I have used. So what I'll do is I'll take all my notes and I'll put each piece of information on a sticky note. In particular, I like to make each person I interviewed a different color. So then I can tell if a bunch of stuff is clustering, but it's all one color. Well, one person really cared about that one thing. But if there's a lot of different colors, maybe it's something that's important to a lot of users. So what I'll do once I have all the notes on sticky notes is I'll reorganize them and put things that are alike each other together. And that way, if something has a lot of sticky notes, I know that it's probably more important to my users. Whereas if it doesn't have as many, maybe it's something that one person just cared about loudly. There is a name for this technique. It's called affinity mapping. Here we go. So you can look it up online if you're curious to know more about the technique. Let's get back to that e-learning dashboard, though. Here are the 3 user goals that we ended up with after we interviewed our users. So here's the final dashboard again. In order to address the goals here, we did a couple things. First, this is formatted for email and mobile. So you can see that this is kind of a long, skinny dashboard. There's actually more of it that I'm going to scroll down to in a second. But that made it easy for our executives to get this information in email. And we also put that more important information that they were asking for, the stuff with more sticky notes, that's all on top, so they can get that stuff immediately and have it top of mind. You can also see big wins is up here with our cumulative revenue. You can see where all those spikes are. And for understanding that impact of e-learning on revenue, that was one of our lower goals. And if we scroll down to the bottom here, we can see the revenue on the bottom. So those dark green lines are showing our in-person revenue, and the light green is showing our e-learning revenue. So we can see it's actually been pretty successful. So that was good. So we came to some decisions about how we were addressing these goals by using ideation techniques. Which brings us to the next phase, ideate. Now this is probably the part of the process that you're all most comfortable with because you're probably going to be doing it in some form already if you use Tableau. But coming into this phase, we had a few clear goals for our dashboard. And when we ideate, we want to come up with a couple ways to address each of those goals. Interesting thing about the ideate phase is that we're going for quantity over quality. In most parts of our lives, we kind of want to do the opposite, but ideation is definitely an exception. The point here is to brain dump as much as possible and go through it all later. Now, Tableau is a great tool to ideate in. You can play with your data, you can kind of see how it works, get a lot of ideas, but it's not the only tool. And some of our goals aren't going to be explicitly about visualization. So I'm going to touch on a couple different ideation techniques that you can use as well. The first one is just to get inspired. And in order to do that, I like to clip pieces of dashboards or any pieces of UI that I see that I like, so that I can come back to them and look at them if I'm stuck and I want ideas about how to address something. So I'm going to show you a couple different things I've clipped. Here's the first one. Now, I hate sports, but I love this dashboard. And one of the reasons I love it is because it really knows what it's about, and it knows who its audience is. It's not for someone who already knows a ton about this fight. It's really great at drawing you in if you didn't know anything about it. This is also a great use of color. You'll notice that there are actually only 3 colors on this graph, except for those 2 images on it. But it doesn't look drab or dry. It looks like a really interesting dashboard. The other reason I clipped this is because it's a great use of donut charts. I normally try to stay away from them because they're not super clear most of the time, but since this is only showing 2 different donut charts and each donut chart only has 1 value in it, it's actually really great, and it works for this dashboard. Here's another dashboard I clipped. This is about the race to Alaska, and if you don't know what that is, it is it's a race with boats with no motors from the state of Washington to the state of Alaska. It happens every summer. And I thought that this was an awesome dashboard because it's a really good example of storytelling with data used to augment the story. Another thing I liked about it is the circular map in the corner. It's just something I would not have thought to do myself. So I clipped it so I can remember it later. Lastly, I want to give a shout out to the Big Book of Dashboards. This book is seriously like a recipe book for your dashboards, and there are so many examples in it that one of them is bound to be similar to the scenario that you're working on. It's a really good book to keep on your desk if you're someone who creates dashboards regularly. So I'm going to talk about 2 other ideation techniques as well. The first one is called Crazy Eights. And what you're going to do in this technique is you're going to come up with 8 ideas in 5 minutes. Typically, on the design team at least, we actually do fold up papers like this and draw an idea on each one. And it's really fun. This may seem like it's a little bit of a silly exercise, but there is a really good reason that we do it. And it's because our brains like to start filtering ourselves as soon as we come up with any new ideas. We'll go, oh, I'm not sure if that's good enough, or this is okay, but I don't know if it really makes the cut. If you only have 5 minutes, every idea makes the cut. And the point is to really just get everything you're thinking of out there on paper. We're going to go through it later. So usually how this goes is the first 2 ideas are pretty easy, and then you kind of start pushing yourself. So you'll be surprised at what you come up with. The next ideation technique is called blue sky thinking. And this one's a little bit more structured than Crazy Eights. So what you do here is start with your ground ideas. Your ground idea is probably the more mundane idea, probably the first thing that you came up with as the way that you would address those goals. So we'll write those down first. The next thing we do is come up with our blue sky idea. And what that is supposed to be is, if you had a magic wand, how would you solve this user's problem? What would you do if you had anything, any amount of time? So once we have both of these ideas for each of our goals, we're going to try to combine them into what's normally called a mountain idea. And that's supposed to be a more creative solution. So it's probably a little bit more interesting than that ground idea that you originally came up with. And what it does is it pushes you a little bit further to give your user something that might be more appropriate for them. Once we have a ton of different directions we can go, we're going to move on to the validation phase. During this phase, we're going to take the ideas that we think we want to move forward with and get feedback from our users. Before we do that, though, we have too many ideas, so we need to try to break them ourselves. The way I like to try to break my ideas is to go back to the discover phase mentally and think about the scenarios that our users told us they wanted this dashboard for, and then walk through all the ideas that you just came up with and try to figure out, would this dashboard work for that scenario, or does it break? And if it breaks, that's fine, throw it out. It wasn't a good idea. Move forward with the ones that are strong and bring those back to your users. If you really have too many good ideas, another good way to pare down your ideas is called a cost-value matrix. You may have heard of these before. So what you're going to do here, you can tell I like sticky notes, is you just put each of your ideas on a sticky note and kind of move them. Is it a high value? Is it a high cost or low cost? Ideally, what you're looking for is high value, low cost. If something's got a similar amount of value to your user, but it costs more, don't do that one. Do the cheaper one. So once we know what ideas to move forward with, this is when we're going to check back with our users to see how they're going to work with this dashboard that we've started to create for them. So remember that e-learning example I showed you back in the distill phase? This is what we ended up emailing to our executives for feedback. So this was not even a real dashboard. This is just a prototype. We just drew this out as an example of what kind of data we thought we would show, where we would show it, without having to deal with all the data viz wrangling yet. And aside from that, we didn't even have the data yet, and we were still able to make what we thought the dashboard would be, which is pretty cool. So when we emailed this to our exec team, they gave us some feedback. Here's an example of one of the questions they asked us. When they saw this, someone asked us, how do I know how much of our total training revenue has transferred over to e-learning? Here is the graph that was supposed to answer that question for them. And technically, it does answer that question, and we could have taught them how to read it, but then we're gonna have to keep teaching people how to read our graphs, and that's not what we want. That's more work for us, and it's more work for our users. So instead, we went back to the drawing board with this and came up with a new chart. And what this shows is these gray bars show the expected revenue, and the green shows the actual revenue. So here you can start to see pretty clearly that e-learning's bumping us up over. We're not losing money because of it. We're helping more people. Everyone's happy. And we can see that immediately. This is what our users wanted. And it was great that we asked them for feedback because now we were able to give this to them. Now, ideally, you will be able to actually talk to your users rather than emailing them. Unfortunately, with our exec team, they didn't have enough time for more than email. But most of the time, I do like to talk to my users. And I have a couple things that are really useful to keep in mind when you're talking to them. The first one is to pretend a colleague built this. This is going to get you a lot more honest feedback from your users, because when you build someone a dashboard and they don't know how to build a dashboard, they're just really excited that you built them a dashboard. And they're going to be thrilled. They're going to tell you it's great. They might give you a little bit of feedback, but it's not going to be super honest. When you tell them a colleague built it and you're looking for feedback, they are going to tell you all the dirty stuff about it that you can fix. The next thing I like to do is make sure I give my users a task. So it's really easy to actually just take your dashboard and walk your user through it. Hey, this part does this, and if you use this filter, you can see all these things. Unfortunately, that's not going to give you realistic feedback because now your user knows how you think about the dashboard. What you want to see is how your user looks at the dashboard through their own eyes. You don't want to pollute them with what you already think about it. So when you give them a task and just watch them walk through it, you can see where they're having trouble and what's working. Now, it's important when you're giving your users these tasks to make sure that they know you're testing the dashboard, you're not testing them. It's not a quiz. If they get something wrong, it helps you make it better. And lastly, ask your users to think aloud. And this is hard because most of the time when people are using their computer, they're using mobile phones, you're not sitting there typing stuff in saying, oh, I'm typing this because of this, and I looked at this search box for this reason. You're doing everything silently. And so it's really unnatural for people to think aloud while they're using software. So it's going to be something that you have to keep prompting your users to do. And a good way to do that is if you see a user try to do something and go back, if you see them kind of pause or take a breath in, just kind of read their body language and say, hey, what are you thinking right now? Or what did you expect to happen right there? And if they tell you, maybe it's something you can actually make happen, which is awesome. So we've gone through a lot, but the last thing I want to talk about is when are you finished? Because we could definitely go through an never-ending cycle of dashboard creation and validation and editing and validation, but perfect is the enemy of done. So I usually know when I'm finished when I can give my users those mainline tasks and they can get from end to end without stumbling, without trouble, without needing to ask me questions. Then I know the dashboard is something that they can use on their own without my help. So let's recap. So we've gone through this design process: discover, distill, ideate, validate. And I want to touch on one more way to think about this process. This is called the double diamond. And the reason that it's displayed like this is because the diamond kind of represents how many ideas and what type of thinking you're doing. So when you're in the discover phase, we're broadening our perspective, we're asking questions, we're figuring out new things that we didn't know before. During the distill phase, we're going to pull back, develop a perspective, come up with a couple goals. So that's what the kind of joining of the two diamonds is. That's us figuring out what direction we're going with this dashboard. We move on to ideate. We're going to brainstorm, come up with a lot of ways to give our users what they might need. And then for validate, we're pulling back, looking for flaws, and coming up with what that final dashboard is going to be. Here's all of the techniques that we've gone through today, and I'm not going to read them all to you, but I do have some pieces of paper up here if you would like to come get them after the talk, and there are also with my room managers. If you want to just run out and get them without talking to me, that's fine too. I won't feel bad. One last thing though, this design process is iterative, and it's really more of a guideline. It's not something you have to follow to a T. It's not something you have to sit here and spend hours and hours on to make sure you get it right. Any piece of this can be valuable in your dashboard design process. So use what makes sense to you and throw out what doesn't. And you don't have to do it in order either. You can brainstorm, figure out, oh my God, I didn't ask my users these questions. Go back and ask them. That's fine. You don't have to do it in order. So I will be giving this session again tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, after the party. If you liked it, tell your friends. And there's a couple related sessions I want to plug as well. Give you a second to look at those. And finally, please complete that session survey. We really appreciate it. Helps us make our talks better for next year. With that, I will open it up for questions. Oops. And again, if you want to get any of those printouts, you can come up here too. If I were you, I would search for the double diamond design process online. There's a ton of books, but they all cover it kind of differently. The Stanford Design School is a really great resource, though. Yeah. The question was, would the big book of dashboards be better in a hard copy or on Kindle? I am super biased. I hate Kindle. I have a hard copy. I actually had the first hard copy that was ever signed by all 3 authors. I'm very proud of myself. Yeah, tons of pictures. It's really great. Yes? So the question was, how do you prep your users for this end-to-end process? Because it's long and it's different. Yeah? So it kind of depends on the user and how well you know them, what kind of access you have to them. And honestly, sometimes you're not going to have access to them during that validate phase, and all you're going to be able to do is try to break your own ideas or go through things with colleagues. So sometimes I only go through things with colleagues. But during the discover phase, I found that most of the time, if your user's only doing the discover phase, the only times you really need to keep talking to them is just discover and validate, right? So if you're only doing discover, it's like, hey, can you talk to me for a half hour? And most people are pretty cool with that. A lot of the times too, for example, with my dad's friend, this wasn't something he was super familiar with, but I just got a little bit of cred because I was like, hi, I'm a designer and this is what we're doing. So just tell people that a designer told you to do it. Yes?
Do you have any suggestions on how to change the culture at a place to kind of get this? Because a lot of this takes time, and a lot of times they just give me the dashboard now.
It definitely does. Yeah. That's hard. It's really hard. And I mean, even at Tableau, we have a great design culture, but it's been getting better over the years. And I think the best advice I have there is just keep trying, keep doing it. Don't stop, because people, when you do it, start seeing the value. When you only talk about, here's what we do, and I like to put sticky notes on the wall all the time, they're kind of like, why are you doing this? Are you a child? But when you start delivering things that are really valuable, people start going, oh my God, this is amazing. And then you'll start seeing other people put sticky notes up, and then you're like, yes. Yes?
I really like your mockup, and I've been trying to get our developers to do that. What do you use? Because they go into Tableau
Okay, so the question was what do you do the mockup in? Because people are making mockups into Tableau, and that defeats the purpose. There are a lot of great programs that you can make mockups in. One great one is PowerPoint. Super easy. I actually used to be a PM, and when I was a PM and I didn't use Macs all the time, I used PowerPoint for all my mockups. Additionally, there is another program that we like to use on the design team. It's called Sketch. It's way better than PowerPoint. It also costs $99 a year, so it's not too expensive. Sorry, he answered first. Oh. Yep. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yep. So the question is, how do I get my users to not want tables anymore? That's a really hard one. My suggestion would be to figure out what they're getting out of tables that they're not getting out of the visualizations. Like, why are they so comfortable with tables? Is it just because that's what they're used to? Is it because they don't know what else can happen? One good way to maybe start making them comfortable is to put things kind of side by side. So you can be like, here's the visualization, here's a little bit of that table you wanted, to get them comfortable so that they'll use the visualization. But then at least they have a couple things that they can use so they can start exploring a little bit more. So hopefully that starts to kind of change the direction. Did you still have a question?
Yes. So it's related to mockups again.
Mm-hmm.
Do you use some kind of data already to kind of validate that it actually looks the way that you're doing the mockup? Because what I've seen is that it's a nice scatter plot with dots all
Yep.
over, but then you put in data. It looked really good in the mockup, but with the data, they're all clustered here, and there's one outlier out here, so you don't really get the information.
Yeah, so the question is about making mockups without having the data yet, and sometimes when you have the data, everything looks different. One, sometimes that just happens. Two, what I like to do is kind of try to understand from the people who are administering the database and making the database, if I have input on that, I want to give input on that, right? Because then I can make all the different visualizations I want to make. If I don't have input on that, at least knowing what the structure of the data is so I know what I'm working with, that helps a lot. And then kind of just asking, what are we expecting to see here from the people who are collecting the data, just so you have a better sense. And I mean, sometimes, like I said, we think we're expecting one thing and it's totally different. And if that's what happens, there's not a lot we can do. But in the other cases, at least we're doing everything we can. Yes?
You talk about knowing the users and knowing what they need.
Yep.
What if I have different kinds of users and I'm building a dashboard? How do you approach designing a dashboard, one dashboard for one user?
That's a great question. I would design multiple dashboards for multiple different user types. Do you have a follow-up question now?
That's what I approach with what if there were constraints or one task.
Can you talk just a little bit louder? I'm actually kind of hard of hearing.
Sorry. I mean, if there was a constraint, if I have to put it in one email or one tag, or is it just impossible?
That's a great question. We should talk more. You can when I'm done with this microphone thing, come talk to me. And the question is if I have a ton of users and they all want one dashboard and they have to use it all. Did you all hear him? Great. Yes.
I just didn't hear what you say when you were finished. What were your definition? Or when you were finished?
Oh, when you're finished. So usually that's when like the users can go through all those mainline tasks. So usually you kind of know, the user's going to want to do A, B, and C with this dashboard. So you give them that task and you'll say, hey, how do you find this with this dashboard? And just show them the dashboard, right? And if they can figure out the answer to that question, and ideally they have, they'll probably come up with another question. If they can solve that too with the dashboard, you're pretty golden. Yes?
My question is about how do you balance appeasing the hippos while also giving the users what they need, especially if the executive has like a strong personality?
So the question is, how do you deal with these big hippo personalities and appease them while giving the users what they need? So there are a couple things that you can do. One of them is try to educate the hippos about how they are not the person using the dashboard, and you have heard different things from the people who are actually using the dashboard. If your hippo person is someone who really cares about the productivity and people who are actually using the dashboard getting things done with it, which usually they are, they'll turn around and go, oh my God, I was totally wrong. Yes, make it for the right people. Sometimes they won't do that. Sometimes they'll say, well, I need things out of this dashboard too, and this is exactly what I want. So in that case, I try to throw them a bone. Just put something in there that you know that they're gonna like, and put some other things in that you're like, oh, you didn't want this, but it's here because it's good for your users. And hopefully that keeps them happy. Did you have a question? No.
So is part of the goal in the end to make the dashboard completely intuitive, where it just gave someone had no context or link that they could use it themselves without any instruction? Or do you plan like short trainings or informational material ahead of time to supplement like the dashboard?
The question is the goal to make our dashboards completely intuitive, or do we have trainings and supplemental materials? I'm more of the mindset that I want to make everything intuitive so that people don't have to ask me questions and don't need trainings to use things. Some things are going to be more complicated than that, though, right? Obviously, like people do need trainings to use Tableau, and that's who I design for. And that's a fact of life. But one of the things you can do is say, okay, given that maybe they're going to have to learn one time, like let's make sure that they can do the task they want to do once they've learned it, if it's a super complicated dashboard. Does that make sense? Great. I think we're done with questions.